Hi, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our community meeting for Woodside. My name is Rebecca Ballo, and I'm the Historic Preservation Supervisor. We are a few minutes into our start time. We were going to start at 7:30. We have a few people that have joined us already. I'm going to give some instructions about the live event Q&A while we wait for a few more people to join us. So tonight's virtual meeting is taking place using the Microsoft Teams Live platform. Note that you will not be able to use audio or video to communicate with us. I'm going to be on the call tonight, as well as our other team members in the historic preservation section. So instead of using your audio or your video, you will be able to use the Q&A function to submit written questions and comments. The Q&A is located to the right of your screen. All you need to do is click on the button labeled Ask a Question, enter your name, and then type in your question. All the questions will be reviewed by a moderator before being published for the rest of the audience to view. We will answer your questions during a Q&A period towards the end of tonight's presentation. So please note also that to view any questions that are submitted by other attendees, you can click on the Featured tab located right next to the My Questions tab. And then you can also hide the Q&A pane by clicking the icon with the question mark located in the top right corner of your screen. So right now we are at 7:35. We were scheduled to get started right at 7:30. So we're going to continue now with the rest of the meeting. So again, welcome. My name is Rebecca Ballo, and I'm the supervisor with the Historic Preservation section. So we're going to start off our meeting tonight by watching a video presentation about the staff's evaluation of the Woodside Locational Atlas District. This video has been posted on our website on our project page for approximately 2 weeks now, and we're going to continue to host it on our website. If you have any questions about specific slides or you'd like to, dig into some of the information that we're presenting, there will definitely be time for that once we finish watching the video. So after we're done with the video, we're going to turn it over to John Lieberts, who is our architectural historian and project coordinator for the Woodside project. And again, we'll have plenty of time for question and answer at the conclusion of the video. Thank you very much, and now we'll start off with the video. Hello, and welcome to the Historic Preservation Office's presentation of the evaluation of the Woodside Locational Atlas Historic District. My name is Rebecca Ballo, and I'm the supervisor for the unit. John Lieberts, planner coordinator with our office, will be giving the presentation. We first met with the Woodside Civic Association in the spring of 2019 to discuss this project. Survey crews were out in the neighborhood through most of 2019, photographing each building and completing a detailed architectural survey of all of the buildings in Woodside. Our team looked at the survey forms and the data that was collected and compiled our initial recommendations and evaluation of the district. That information is included in this PowerPoint. If you have any questions, concerns, or comments about the information presented here, you can find our contact information on the last slide of this PowerPoint, or on the Historic Preservation website, or on the dedicated project page for the Woodside Locational Atlas Historic District Study. I will now turn the presentation over to John Lieberts. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. I am John Lieberts, a historic preservation planner with Montgomery Planning. The presentation will consist of an overview of relevant historic preservation policies and how we arrived here, the evaluation process for designation, other designated historic districts of similar historical context, a brief historic context of the history of Woodside, data from the research and survey, and discussion of future meetings. The Planning Board listed the Woodside Locational Atlas District in the Locational Atlas and Index of Historic Sites when it was established in 1976. The Locational Atlas identifies potentially significant historic resources. This listing provides partial protection from demolition and substantial alteration. In 1979, the Master Plan for Historic Preservation directed the Historic Preservation Commission to systematically evaluate resources listed to the locational atlas to determine whether the resources meet criteria for designation in the master plan. The requirements for listing in the master plan for historic preservation are outlined in Chapter 24A of the County Code. The locational atlas continues to operate as a holding list until a resource is assessed for designation in the master plan. This evaluation often coincides with updates to sector plans. Evaluation of the Woodside Locational Atlas District started in the 1990s as part of a general examination of railroad suburbs in the county, but the process was placed on hold and the district has never been assessed against the designation criteria. Earlier this year, the Forest Glen Montgomery Hills Sector Plan recommended evaluation of the district as a near-term goal. Next, we will discuss the overall evaluation process. Evaluation for historic designation falls into two categories. First, there's historical and cultural significance. Here, the district has character, interest, or value as part of the development, heritage, or cultural characteristics of the county. It is associated with a historic event, or it's identified with persons who influence society. Next, you have architectural and design significance. These properties embody a distinct style, they are the work of a master architect or builder, they are of clear artistic value, or they represent an established feature of a community. Historic resources must meet one or more criteria in order to be designated to the master plan. Determination of eligibility for listing on the master plan consists of three major components. There's archival research at local, state, and national repositories, and outreach with community members. There's architectural survey of the individual buildings within the historic district, and there's an evaluation of integrity of the buildings themselves. All this feeds into a period of significance and a determination of eligibility. When we consider eligibility, the period of significance is based on the archival and architectural data. And this is when a property was associated with important events, activities, or persons, or attained the characteristics which qualify it for the master plan for historic preservation. Next, here are some examples of similar historic districts listed in the master plan for historic preservation. All of these are railroad suburbs established along the metropolitan branch of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad in the last quarter of the 19th century. On the left is the Linden Historic District. This railroad and later streetcar suburb was first platted in 1873. It consists of 17 Gothic Revival, Queen Anne, and later Craftsman-era houses. The Tacoma Park Historic District is in the center. This is the largest historic district in the county. Tacoma Park is significant as both an early railroad suburb established in 1883 and a streetcar suburb. It consists of Queen Anne and shingle-style dwellings from the railroad suburb era, and Craftsman and Colonial Revival bungalows and foursquares from the streetcar era. On the right is the Kensington Historic District. This is a well-preserved turn-of-the-century railroad suburb established in 1890 with Victorian-era residences, curvilinear streets, and a commercial district. Moving on to Woodside, here is some brief information on the history of the community before we look at the architectural survey data. This history will further be developed in later reports. The present-day boundaries of Woodside rest partially within the Wilson family plantation that originated in the mid-1750s. While a few remnants of this context exist within the present landscape, it's important to study the history and impact of chattel slavery and land use in the antebellum period. The Wilson family enslaved African Americans to cultivate tobacco before shifting to other crops. Thomas and Sarah Wilson expanded the family's plantation to over 1,000 acres by the mid-19th century. Their plantation was worth approximately 7 times more than the average farm in their district. The couple built their house near the present-day corner of Spring Street and Georgia Avenue. Shown is a photograph of the house prior to its demolition in the 1950s. In the 1850s, Richard C. Wilson, the son of Thomas and Sarah, established a 120-acre farm, outlined in blue, on his father's land on the west side of Georgia Avenue. His house, shown here, is located today at 8818 First Avenue. The property largely corresponds to the original boundary of the Woodside subdivision. Similar to his father, Richard and Laura Wilson owned enslaved persons. In 1851, he placed an advertisement offering a $20 reward for the return of Samuel William, who unsuccessfully attempted to escape. He listed himself as owning 5 enslaved persons in 1864. The plat map also shows the church lot, the location of Grace Episcopal Church established prior to the Civil War. This is highlighted in yellow. Historians state that Thomas Wilson donated the land for the church. The Wilson House is one of the only sites in the Woodside Locational Atlas District in Silver Spring associated with the Civil War, the Battle of Fort Stevens, and the defense of Washington, D.C. At the start of the war, Union soldiers patrolled the county for Confederate and secessionist activity, utilized present-day Georgia Avenue as one of the major thoroughfares, and had encampments in the area. The heirs of the Wilson family claimed $5,431 of damage and materials taken by the Union Army without compensation. This included fence rails, hay, oats, corn, livestock, and produce. In addition, Union soldiers encouraged enslaved persons to join the Army. Moses Whitecan fled the Wilson plantation and enlisted in the 2nd Rhode Island Infantry. Thomas N. Wilson wrote the Provost Marshal, and the letter is on the left, demanding the return of Whitecan to his property, but it is unknown if the Union ultimately complied. Later, in September 1862, Union soldiers killed Thomas N. Wilson over a disagreement regarding the confiscation of livestock. In 1864, after the Battle of Monocacy, Jubal Early approached Washington, D.C. from the north, traveled southward down present-day Georgia Avenue in an attempt to capture the capital. The Union ultimately prevailed at the Battle of Fort Stevens, located just south of Woodside on Georgia Avenue. However, further research needs to be completed regarding the use of the Wilson House during this battle. Historians have recognized Richard and Laura Wilson as Confederate sympathizers who hosted General John C. Breckinridge and other officers at their home before the battle. Later in her life, Laura Wilson stated that she cared for a wounded Confederate soldier during this period as well. Here is an 1865 map that shows the general area after the Civil War. The 2 red arrows point to the Wilson House on the west side of Georgia Avenue and his brother's house on the east side, and the yellow arrow points to the Grace Episcopal Church and Cemetery located on the northeast corner of the Woodside Locational Atlas District. In 1873, the Metropolitan Branch of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad opened in Montgomery County. This map from 1878 shows the line traversing the Silver Spring area. Shown on the map is Grace Episcopal Church and Cemetery and its parsonage on the west side of Georgia Avenue, which is circled in blue. The parsonage was constructed in the late 1860s and completed by 1870. While no longer associated with the church, the building remains standing at 9120 Georgia Avenue. In 1889, Benjamin Layden purchased the Wilson property from Laura C. Wilson after the death of her husband for $23,000. He submitted subdivision plats the following years. This is the starting point of Woodside as a railroad suburb that opened the area to residents of the District of Columbia. The promotional map shown here documents the total area of Woodside subdivided by Layden. The Fenwick train station is noted in the southwestern corner. It is circled in red. Also visible is the Wilson House, circled in blue. Laura Wilson repurchased the entire block from Layden after the sale and remained on the property. In addition, in the northeastern corner of the map, you can see Grace Episcopal Church and the parsonage, which are circled green. Here is another view of the Woodside community in 1890. This map shows Woodside within the greater context of this section of Montgomery County. Layden advocated for the construction of the Woodside Station, which would soon be built thereafter. The red arrow points to the future station located on the west side of the railroad tracks near the center of the community. In 1897, the Washington, Woodside, and Forest Glen Railway and Power Company opened a streetcar line on the east side of Georgia Avenue. The streetcar stopped at Ballard Street and provided another means of access to the community. This line ran more regularly than the B&O and fostered further middle-class development. Here's a photograph of a streetcar and a general map of streetcars within the region. The red arrow points to the Forest Glen line. This 1917 map shows development within Woodside during its first 30 years. The individual square boxes represent houses. As you can see, construction remained somewhat sparse. In addition, in the 1920s, bus service replaced the streetcar line and a fire destroyed the Woodside station. Therefore, the community's period of significance as a railroad and streetcar suburb ended at this time, as the automobile became the primary mode of transportation. Before we shift to the survey data and map analysis, it's important to always remember that Woodside was planned and developed for Caucasians and excluded people of color through de jure and de facto segregation. For example, take 16th Street Village, outlined on the map, and subdivided in the late 1930s. The restrictive covenants barred African Americans and other ethnic groups from purchasing homes in the community. Such housing discrimination remained in place into the 1960s, and its long-lasting effects continue to influence inequalities in our county and nation. With that as our foundation, we can look at the data from our survey and research. This 1931 map is a good place to start, as it shows construction to that date. I have outlined the 3 different subdivisions and the number of dwellings within each. The blue is Layden's original Woodside subdivision that consisted of 76 buildings in 1931. The red is his addition to Woodside with 54 buildings. And the green is an area called North Woodside, subdivided by Claggett and Stadler in 1923 and 1925. Within that short period of time, this subdivision already had 96 buildings. When you overlay the present-day Woodside Locational Atlas District boundary on this map, you can see that the boundary only includes 55 buildings within the original 1889 subdivision. This is a total of only 24% of the buildings shown on this map. That's an issue when establishing the historic context of the neighborhood. As part of the survey, we evaluated the property's date of construction for the entire Locational Atlas District. I placed it within this graph to show you the 3 different development trends. There are 2 buildings that predate the subdivision, the Wilson House and the Church Parsonage, but the first period of development is from 1890 to 1929 that marks Woodside as a railroad and streetcar suburb. The period ends with the Great Depression as construction stops. This also coincides with the end of the passenger service to Woodside by means of the railroad or streetcar. The next period starts circa 1937 with programs related to the New Deal and extends to the 1970s. Finally, we have the third period of construction between 1980 and the present day. Here is a pie chart that shows the 3 different periods of construction. In the first period between 1850 and 1930, you have a total of 33 houses. In the second period between 1930 and 1970, there are 145 remaining houses. And in the third period between 1980 and 2020, you have approximately 110 houses. Here's a map of Woodside that shows the 3 different periods of development and the locations of these houses. In green is the first period of development between 1850 and 1930. This accounts for about 11.5% of the buildings. In yellow is the second period of development between 1930 and 1970. This accounts for about 50% of the buildings. And in red, we have the third period of development after 1980. This accounts for 38% of the buildings. The most significant period for Woodside would be its origin as a railroad and streetcar suburb. With this in mind, we evaluated the buildings constructed during that first period of significance. The 1931 map serves as the baseline for development within that period. We evaluated the entire original 1889 subdivision as outlined here to see what buildings remained standing and what buildings were demolished. You can see that 33 remain extant and 44 were demolished. More than half of the dwellings from that period have been demolished, including the school and the church. That is separate from the loss of the 2 railroad stations in the community. We further evaluated the remaining 33 dwellings. Upon review, 6 of these buildings is what we call non-contributing. There have been far too many alterations or changes, resulting in a building that no longer has historic integrity. So on the map, we have 26 contributing buildings highlighted in blue, 6 non-contributing buildings highlighted in yellow, and 1 building that has been moved off of Georgia Avenue that's highlighted in green. This map shows the contributing and moved buildings within the original subdivision. The 27 houses account for 35% of the dwellings shown on this map. When we consider these buildings within the context of the present-day locational atlas district, that's less than 10% of the entire district for a period of significance between 1890 and 1930. This is simply an insufficient number for the creation of a historic district. For these reasons, staff's recommendation is to remove all the properties from the Locational Atlas and Index of Historic Sites, except for the 6 sites or districts shown here: Grace Episcopal Church, Cemetery, and Parsonage, and the Wilson House will be examined further for its historical and design significance as one of the few antebellum sites in Woodside and Greater Silver Spring. The Wilson House presents the opportunity to reflect on the 19th century history of the area, the lives and tribulations of the enslaved African Americans, and the defense of the capital during the Battle of Fort Stevens in the Civil War. The other 4 properties will be examined primarily for their architectural significance, but further research will be conducted regarding the individuals who built and resided in these dwellings. The next step in the process will be the community meeting, where this video will be played for individuals who did not watch it in advance. Questions and comments will be taken after the video. Then, staff will move forward with drafting the delisting report for the overall district except for the sites previously mentioned. The scheduling of public hearings on this item at the Historic Preservation Commission and the Planning Board will be scheduled for the winter of 2021. If you have any questions or comments, please send them to Historic Preservation staff at the email addresses listed below. We will make sure to address these comments and questions at the community meeting.
Good evening, everyone. I'm John Laborth. I'm a historic preservation planner. Thanks for attending the meeting tonight. And before we open up the floor to questions, again, you can type those questions in the Q&A box. I wanted to reiterate that the 6 properties retained on the Locational Atlas per staff's recommendation will be fully evaluated at a later stage for their architectural or historical significance. Some of these properties have difficult issues regarding race, equity, the Civil War, and slavery. By separating these out from the rest of the district, we will be able to have in-depth conversations with property owners, community, and county leadership about how to move forward with any potential designation if warranted. And to start off tonight's Q&A session, Casey Roan, a preservation planner, will serve as our moderator, and she will read and direct questions to Rebecca or myself. Thank you.
Great, thank you, John. So one question that we didn't quite get into in the presentation was, how will this affect the permitting process for residents? And Rebecca, maybe you can speak to that a little bit.
Sure, thank you, Casey. So as it currently exists, because Woodside is a Locational Atlas Historic District, the Department of Permitting Services already flags all permits that come in through Rockville. So any permits for fences, hardscaping to demolition and new construction are already routed under the existing ordinance and designation to the Historic Preservation Office, and we currently review those to see if the work qualifies as a substantial alteration or not. Easily over 95% of the work items that come through are determined to not be a substantial alteration, and we write letters of administrative approval to go back to DPS, and then the work is approved. If work is considered a substantial alteration, then it goes to the Historic Preservation Commission for their review. That happens maybe to 1 or 2 permits a year. Now, in the future, if the Locational Atlas District were removed, which would only be accomplished after future hearings with the Historic Preservation Commission and the Planning Board, if they were to accept such a recommendation, then that permitting requirement, that initial review with historic preservation, would be removed entirely for the district. We are recommending, however, that for the 6 sites to be studied further, that they be made locational atlas sites at this time. So their permitting requirement would actually be exactly the same as it is right now. That if the work is determined to not be a substantial alteration, it is administratively just approved. And we're going to be working to bring those sites forward for full consideration as master plan historic sites. And then as part of that process, we would further determine, what work items could continue to be administratively approved and which ones, again, such as large additions, large construction items would then go to the Historic Preservation Commission. But we would also work with individual property owners through that process to see, what are the real, what we call, contributing features of each historic site. For example, a cemetery is different than a single family house and would have different considerations under design review. So I know that this might spur further questions in the Q&A, and I'm happy to answer more questions about that. Thank you. Back to you,
Great.
Casey.
Thank you, Rebecca. So the first question that has come in here is, will we be provided access to the correspondence, including emails and photographs that were used to determine why each specific property was designated for possible inclusion for historic designation? And Rebecca, if you could answer that one as well, that'd be great.
Sure. Thank you, Casey. We are happy to provide to any member of the public the information that we have about individual properties, including correspondence, photographs, and the survey forms, and then any data that we have. Most of it we do have still available digitally. Our offices are currently closed to the public because of COVID restrictions, but we can also make photocopies of any information that we have in the property files in our offices in Wheaton, and we can make those available as well. I would recommend, I believe we have this questioner's email address, so I'm happy to follow up afterwards to make sure that we can provide you all of the information in a timely manner. Thank you. Back to you, Casey.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. So the next question I'm going to send to you, John, and I'm going to combine these since they're related to the designation process. So again, this question is, what is the timeline expected to determine whether a specific property is designated? These are the individual properties that we're talking about designating. And then how will the owners of these properties be involved in the determination of the designation, and to what extent does that engagement matter? John, to you.
Thank you, Casey. So regarding the designation process, with delisting the historic district, the Locational Atlas and Index of Historic Sites is a list that lives with the planning board. So they vote up or down whether something is on the atlas or not. And so as we move forward with the delisting of the district, as staff's recommending, there will be public hearings both at the Historic Preservation Commission and at the planning board. Those are public hearings where your testimony could be taken and the community's input is considered. Regarding the ones we're recommending for retention, if the planning board does retain those properties on the locational atlas, there will be a much further and more in-depth analysis of each of those individual properties to see whether they meet the criteria outlined in the county code for designation on the master plan for historic preservation. To be designated on the master plan, very similar to locational atlas, there's public hearings at the Historic Preservation Commission, there's public hearings at the planning board, and ultimately it's decided by a vote by the county council. So it's a process that offers much opportunity for public input. And obviously staff is willing to work with property owners throughout this process to ensure that we're providing you with all the information you need as well. Thank you, Casey.
Great. Thank you, John. So the next question, and John, maybe you can speak to this one as well. Can you point to any examples in which the Historic Preservation Commission has recommended that a house be designated and then that was later denied?
Sure. So again, the Historic Preservation Commission, they make a recommendation to the planning board, and the planning board makes a recommendation to the county council. This happens often enough in Montgomery County. Just 2 years ago, there was an office building actually in Silver Spring that the commission The Historic Preservation Commission recommended for listing on the locational atlas, which the planning board denied. So it's not always, just because one commission or board recommends it doesn't mean it always happens.
Great, thank you. So Rebecca, I'm going to let you answer this next question. One of the 6 sites being considered for individual designation is being considered for addition to the Central Business District. If the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission recommends that the Central Business District be expanded, what would that mean for this site?
Sure, thank you, Casey, and that's a great question. As many people in Woodside know, there are some concurrent planning processes going on here. The council recently adopted, for example, the Forest Glen Montgomery Hills sector plan that took in a portion of Woodside. The Historic Preservation Office is undertaking this study specific to the locational atlas status of the district. And now the planning board is also beginning its work, the planning department, on the Silver Spring plan. I'd like to clarify that question a little bit. The plan boundaries that are being studied for Silver Spring is not necessarily an expansion of the Central Business District. It is just the plan boundary areas that take in a number of single family neighborhoods. But the Silver Spring plan, which is a separate planning effort, is not implying, nor is it recommending at this time, an expansion of the CBD as we understand that as a planning tool or as a zoning tool. So the separate process of working on the Silver Spring plan is something that our team is also fully engaged in. There's a whole other project team that is working on that. And the representatives from the planning department, I believe actually they have a meeting with Woodside coming up, very soon. They are meeting with all the single family neighborhoods to solicit feedback and input, and then also to start to explain out some of the plan goals that have been articulated by the planning board to date. Now, there currently exists within the existing Central Business District in Silver Spring and the surrounding area a whole host of other locational atlas districts, locational atlas sites, and master plan sites as well. So those are governed separately by the Historic Preservation Ordinance, which is administered by the Historic Preservation Commission. So that designation as a historic property coexists with other sector plans, other master plans, and even with other rezoning amendments. So one, doesn't necessarily dovetail with the other or affect another. This recommendation that we are bringing forward for the Woodside Locational Atlas District and for the individual sites is really separate and apart from the Silver Spring plan. So thank you, Casey. Back to you.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. So just a reminder to attendees, please feel free to keep typing your questions into the question box. These are great and I think helpful questions for everyone to hear. We have another one that I'm going to let you answer, Rebecca, here with sort of a couple questions here about the costs and benefits of historic designation. So why should an owner of a potentially designated house be happy or satisfied by the possibility of designation? And then what are the costs and benefits for the homeowner if the house does end up on the final list?
Sure, thank you, Casey. So there's a couple of things and I'm going to try and unpack each one of those. One of the advantages to being designated as a historic property in Montgomery County is that it allows property owners to take advantage of historic preservation rehabilitation tax credits, both at the county level and then potentially at the state level as well. So our county rehab tax credits are currently, they're only available for designated master plan sites and master plan districts. So those sites have pretty much the same permitting requirements that Woodside currently has, that have existed for the Woodside Locational Atlas District for over 40 years, but properties in Woodside cannot take advantage of the tax credits. The tax credits are a 25% credit on eligible rehab work that are then applied back to an owner's property taxes. So for example, if you incur, $10,000 painting your wood frame house, you would be eligible for a $2,500 tax credit that would be applied to your property bill. And one of the reasons this credit exists here in Montgomery County and statewide, for many other local historic district commissions, is that the council recognizes that there is a benefit and there is a cost to maintaining a historic property. The maintenance needs for some of these properties with the wood, the wood frame dwellings, with the gingerbread trim, a lot of the historic elements are very maintenance intensive, and the property tax credits are meant to help offset that. It is also an honorific listing as well, for the planning board and the council to recognize that these properties are unique and they have particular stewardship needs that other properties do not, but that through their designation and highlighting the history of these sites, that it makes for a richer understanding of the county's history and a better understanding of our own communities. So thank you, Casey. Back to you.
Great, thank you. So we haven't had any more new questions come in. So I'll give folks a moment here to think about any last questions they'd like to ask. And maybe while you're doing that, John, maybe you could take a minute and just review the next steps again one more time.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Casey. So again, after this meeting, any other feedback we get via email, you can send that to me as well after the meeting's over. Staff's going to start working on drafting the delisting report for the Woodside Locational Atlas District this winter. We hope to schedule meetings at the Historic Preservation Commission in February or March. And then the planning board the date for the planning board will be determined after that. So that's the tentative timeline moving forward, and obviously all this is contingent on COVID-19 and access to resources and other such issues that are presently occurring. Thank you, Casey.
Great, thank you, John. So one final question has come in that maybe Rebecca, you can speak to. Do you have any sense as to whether or not, for example, insurance costs increase once a house is designated? Is there any effect on property tax increases by virtue of designation?
Sure, thank you, Casey. And that's another great question. In my experience, there is no impact on the insurance costs one way or the other associated with historic designation as a site or as a district. And this is based on my experience with designating historic sites in Maryland and Virginia for many years now. I have also not seen, and studies bear out, that there is not an impact in terms of property taxes increasing. We live in an area, in the Washington, D.C. region where land values are very, very high. It is not unusual, for example, to see a single family lot where the land is valued at $500,000 and then the structure itself is valued at $200,000 or $250,000. That is the more common scenario that we all live with here in Washington, D.C. So no, I have not seen a property tax increase associated with the designation of historic properties. Thank you. Back to you, Casey.
Great, thank you. So now we're having many more questions come in. So thank you so much for your questions. Let me take a minute here to get back to where we were in the list. Okay, so maybe Rebecca, you can speak about this since you were just talking about the tax credit program. What is eligible for the tax credit other than exterior painting? What sort of work?
Thanks, Casey. There are many, many items included in our historic preservation tax credit program. And Casey very helpfully dropped a link to our website into the chat. So I'd encourage people to check that out. For everybody we have their contact information as well that RSVP'd, we can also work to send you a direct link. So typical items like painting your house, repairing your roof, repointing your chimney, if the wood has rotted out on your steps or on your porch, which happens it happens frequently. Replacing rotted wood, replacing rotted trim. Some of the soft costs associated with larger rehabs are also included, including consulting fees. We do not offer tax credits for interior items. So for example, if your basement needs waterproofing, if your floors need to be refinished, if you need to undertake plaster repair on the inside of your house. However, the State Historic Preservation Office does offer its own historic preservation rehab tax credit program for sites that are locally designated and found to be eligible for the National Register or listed on the National Register. So that's, again, a separate state program. They deal with the interior and the exterior, but most general maintenance items on the exterior are covered by our tax credit program. Movable items are not. So for example, if you need nails to put in new siding, that's an item, you can put in nails for lots of things. If you need to buy a bandsaw to do some of the woodwork, that would not be included in the tax credit. But the wood, the paint, the caulk, all the rest of the hard cost of the materials needed to put on the house, that would also qualify for the tax credit. Okay, back to you, Casey.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. That was helpful. So the next question is for you, John. There were a number of properties that were not listed for potential designation that seem old and grand and historic, and it was a little bit of a surprise maybe to some residents that those historic properties were not recommended for designation. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yes, thank you, Casey. That's a great question. And so when staff reviewed the architectural data and our archival research and performed that map analysis, we look at periods of significance. And the period of significance mostly for Woodside that we examined was its history as a railroad and a streetcar suburb between about 1890 and 1930. And when we looked at the analysis, we came up that there's a insufficient number of resources left to express that period on its own due to the demolition and other factors. So after that, to be individually listed on the master plan, you really have to have exceptional architectural significance and also historic integrity. So we look at what changes have occurred to the building over time. Some of those other houses from the 1890s and 1900s have had a number of changes to them that have occurred prior to the district being created, or even while the district was undergoing review at the HPC. With that in mind, we also looked at other periods of significance as well into the mid-20th century. We looked at 16th Street Village. There were some interesting homes of cottage influences and log houses, but it was really a typical FHA finance brick houses that were developed in the majority of the district, and it lacked amenities that usually came with these subdivisions. And also that subdivision itself had integrity issues as well. So to kind of cycle back to the main question again, why could something be left off? It could be because it's not the best example of the style. We had about 3 of the houses from that early railroad suburb history that we called out individually to be further studied. And we had a bungalow from the 1920s that I really related more to the streetcar suburb era to be further studied as well. Thank you, Casey.
Great. Thank you, John. I'm going to let you answer this next question as well. John, can you go back and cover which are the 6 individual properties that might be designated?
Sure. And Kevin, if you could put this on a split screen with my desktop, we can pull up the slide. Great. Thank you, Kevin. So the ones that we have called out to be further studied, this doesn't mean they're we still have to see if they warrant designation, if they meet the criteria outlined in the county code. So chapter 24A that regulates that. We have 5 individual houses, and we have the Grace Episcopal Church and Cemetery site along with the parsonage located across the street. So these were the 6 sites that were called out for further study to see if they qualify for master plan status and the listing in the master plan for historic preservation. Thank you, Casey.
Great, thank you. So next question is there any historic significance to having one of the 1945, 1946 era houses, even if it's not officially designated? John, could you answer that?
I'll try to answer that as best as I can. I'm not sure of the exact question, but you know, those houses were built. You know, they could have been built with FHA financing, but in terms of being, once you're removed from the atlas, you'll no longer have those permitting requirements that are currently you're subject to as being a property in a locational atlas district. You know, and this is important to remember always, just because you don't meet those designation criteria, it doesn't mean your house isn't historic or have value. And that's not what we're trying to say, but there's specific criteria that the properties have to meet to be designated on the master plan for historic preservation. Thank you, Casey.
Thank you, John. So John, could you also go back and cover a little bit, maybe what is the current designation status of Woodside, and what was the significance of it that led it to be listed in the locational atlas in the first place?
Sure. So the atlas was created in 1976 by the planning board. And this is basically a holding list that for properties that are potentially historically significant. Many of the railroad suburbs that were along the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad that was opened in 1873 were listed on the locational atlas to be further studied. In the 1990s, the planning staff actually undertook designating many of these properties in subdivisions that were along the railroad. Woodside was considered, but that process was put on pause based on feedback by both the commission and by the community. And so with the completion of the Forest Glen Montgomery Hills Master Plan, one of the goals was actually to go back and to complete it to determine whether it should be listed or not. This was a short-term goal, and this plan was just approved within this year. And so we're moving forward with it today to answer this question once and for all. Thank you, Casey.
Great. Thank you, John. So Rebecca, maybe you can speak to this next question. So we have a resident who says, thank you for explaining how the designation and the planning side of things sort of work together, but also separately. And the question is sort of who trumps who in the decision-making process? For example, if missing middle housing is approved in Woodside, maybe as part of the new Silver Spring plan, would you or the Historic Preservation Commission be able to keep a house on the list from being developed? Would it somehow protect that property?
Sure, thanks, Casey. So that's a great question. And there are a couple of different questions embedded in that. So I'll start with the missing middle housing. So, you know, missing middle housing and the county's initiatives to try and promote it, that's really it's a very broad toolbox. And there are already, you know, many tools that currently exist to promote missing middle housing, you know, and some of which are already evident in Woodside or in districts like it. You know, for example, in our Tacoma Park Historic District, we have a number of accessory dwelling units that have been approved in the past couple of years. There are duplexes in some of our historic districts. There are, you know, moderately priced, excuse me, dwelling units in others. So, you know, whatever you know, missing middle, whatever additional policies or, you know, zoning initiatives that are adopted as part of the Silver Spring plan or any other plan, you know, to promote missing middle housing, a lot of those policies already comfortably coexist with a number of our suburban and urban and even rural historic districts and sites. So separately, you know, how would it impact one site in particular? I'll use an example, a zoning example in our Clarksburg Rural Village Historic District. I don't know if people have been up to Clarksburg lately to see it, but so right up Maryland 355, we have our Clarksburg Rural Village Historic District, and along Frederick Road, you know, a number of those properties that are in the Rural Village District have zoning that, for example, could allow townhouse development. But just because a zone allows townhouse development, it's not specifically excluded, does not mean that developing townhouses on that property and, say, demolishing a historic single-family house would be approved by the Historic Preservation Commission. So when the county council determines that a property meets the historic preservation criteria and is worthy of being designated as a master plan site or district, any alterations in that district, whether it's by a private developer, by anybody, or even by a public entity who may own the property, it has to conform with the requirements of the historic preservation ordinance, which means that the alteration has to be architecturally and historically compatible with that resource. And I'll say more broadly, with a lot of our planning efforts, we all work together, the housing planners, the historic preservation planners, the urban designers, and the public as well, to balance all of these interests, with our initiatives. And it's certainly something that we are aware of with our designations, but when something is designated as historic, the alteration needs to meet Chapter 24A under the law. So thank you, Casey.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. So one other question has come in. This is, again, the last question on our list. So if you still have anything in mind, please go ahead and type it in the chat now. So John, this is a question about historic significance. How does the history here of plantations and slavery and racial issues, how does that usually impact historic preservation significance?
So I'd say with our master plan sites and how we do designations today, the contributions often of enslaved African Americans in the history of chattel slavery has been historically overlooked. And so some of the sites in Woodside, like the Wilson House, is one of the few that actually offer the opportunity to recognize and confront this history. Many times these sites have been lost, and there aren't many other sites from this in the mid-18th century. And so with that in mind, that's what these sites offer as a opportunity for the community to engage in discussion. And by pulling these separate from the delisting process, we can take a much more in-depth look at the history of these properties, the owners, the individuals who worked and lived on these properties, try to bring that to the forefront and to light to make sure that all of these conversations and historical narratives are being fully expressed. And then we can have that conversation with the community, with the Historic Preservation Commission, internally with staff, and also with the county council, how we recognize these properties for designation or perhaps in some other way, if not in designation. Thank you, Casey.
Thank you, John. So Rebecca, maybe you can answer this last question that's come in. What does the state look for in addition to what you look for? So this may be in reference to historic designation, and it may also include reference to potential tax credit opportunities.
Thank you, Casey. So in determining National Register eligibility, the state looks at the National Register criteria, which are promulgated by the National Park Service. So those are a very broad-based set of criteria that look at historical significance, archaeological significance, architectural significance, among some others. So the National Register designation and review process is related, since obviously it's a historic preservation review process, but it's really a different one that involves the State Historic Preservation Office and then also the National Park Service to see if those criteria have been correctly applied. And then in terms of applying that to the tax credits as well, the state looks at whether or not the work complies with a set of standards that are called the Secretary of the Interior Standards for Rehabilitation, the Secretary being the Secretary of the Interior with the National Park Service. So again, those standards, when they're applied to the interior of the home and the exterior of the home, or the building, the structure, the site, are looking to make sure that those character-defining features of the resource are being preserved and maintained and enhanced as part of the work that the credit is meant, that the credit is being used to apply to. I think that gets added, you know, if not, or if the person who's asked this question would like more information about that specifically, you know, again, please feel free to email John or to email me separately after the presentation, and I'll try and answer that a little more accurately if I didn't quite get at it. So thank you, Casey.
Thanks, Rebecca. So one other question has come in here that's, you know, Todd has said maybe a little off topic, but I think is interesting as well. How do we use this research and historical narratives that are developed for public education efforts? Rebecca, maybe you can talk a little bit to that question.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And that is also, you know, a topic of interest for our office, for the Historic Preservation Commission, and for the Planning Board as well. So broadly, I would reference our new Historic Markers program, or we had a Historic Markers program, and now we're bringing it back this year. So a lot of the research that, you know, that we write or that we use, you know, for very, you know, specific projects or as part of sector plans, we end up hosting that research on our website. We also share that research with Montgomery History, the countywide historical society, and with other local historical societies for them to use in their interpretive efforts, you know, talks, panels, historical markers that they put up. We also are in the process now of designing and writing our own historical markers in the planning department and putting those up in locations around the county, trying to tie that into recently adopted sector plans. So, you know, public education and outreach is a large part of what our office does, of our programming. We also, you know, sponsor talks and lectures with the other local and statewide historical societies, and the research that we do, you know, that we share out with the communities, with other researchers, you know, with students, for example, who are coming from the University of Maryland. We try to get this information out as broadly as we can. We also publish books within the planning department and other, you know, visual and written materials. At one point, you know, to correspond with our Montgomery Modern initiative, we created a whole series of traveling panels that talked about the mid-century modern architecture of Montgomery County. And those were hosted out at NIST in Gaithersburg for a while, and they also traveled around the county libraries. So that's also another, you know, outreach and public education effort that we're involved in, and we're looking to do more. So I know that was kind of, you know, a little bit much maybe in terms of information, but if you'd like more information, you know, please contact us and I'll be happy to share it. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Rebecca. So we haven't had any additional questions come in. That was the last one in our queue. So I think, Rebecca, we're ready to turn it back over to you for some final concluding remarks for the meeting.
Thank you. Thank you, Casey. Thank you, John. Thank you, Kevin, for running the show for us behind the scenes. And most of all, thank you to everybody in Woodside. I'd like to thank also the members of the Woodside Civic Association who worked closely with our office, you know, over the last year and a half to get word out to the neighborhood regarding the survey, regarding the meeting tonight and the best format that we could bring this information to Woodside. I appreciate very much all of you joining us tonight. We will keep this PowerPoint up on our website. We will also have an updated FAQ page for our website, and my contact information and John's is also available on the project page and on our website if this spurs additional questions, or if there were questions, you know, particular to your property or your interests or the neighborhood that you just didn't want to ask tonight for any reason. Please feel free. Contact us directly. The project timeline, we believe that will hold. If anything changes, we will update the website. We will certainly update the website with our next steps, and we will also be in close contact with the Civic Association about our next steps. So thank you. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. We are right at 8:30, and we will end the meeting now. Thank you again. Good night.